The wind carried the smell of horse sweat and blood-soaked linen across the plains of Al-Kabur. A 12-year-old boy stood at the head of an army, his hand too small to properly grip the reins of his warhorse. Within 2 years, his name would be spoken in whispers from Cairo to Constantinople, not as a curiosity, but as a terror. What everyone assumes about medieval warfare is that commanders were grizzled veterans, men scarred by decades of campaigning, but that assumption misses a singular fact buried in the chronicles of the year 1146. A boy who had barely reached puberty commanded a force that shattered the most powerful Crusader state in the Levant. He was called Nur ad-Din Mahmud. When his father Imad ad-Din Zengi was assassinated in a tent outside Qalat Jabbar, the entire political order of northern Syria collapsed into chaos. The boy inherited not only a fractured emirate, but also a blood feud, a half-finished war, and an occupying army of Franks camped on his doorstep. Most historians writing in Latin dismissed him as a child playing at war. They recorded his ascension with the tone of men describing a temporary inconvenience, something that would sort itself out as soon as the real powers in the region decided who would carve up Zengi's corpse. The Franks of Edessa saw an opportunity. Their scouts reported that the new emir of Aleppo was barely old enough to grow a beard, that his court was divided between scheming uncles and ambitious generals who had served his father. To them, it looked like a moment to expand. They miscalculated in a way that would define the next 3 decades of Levantine warfare. If this kind of layered history, the kind that peels back the shallow assumptions and reveals the hidden machinery, is what you came here for, then you already know this channel is where you belong. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story and the many others like it that the textbooks leave out. And tell me in the comments, what was the first assumption about medieval warfare that you had to unlearn after hearing this? Here is what the standard account overlooks. Zengi did not leave his son a stable kingdom. He left him a rebellion. The fortress of Edessa, which Zengi had conquered in 1144 after a brutal siege, had been lost within weeks of his death. The local Armenian lords, who had never truly accepted Muslim rule, reopened the gates to the Franks. For a 12-year-old ruler, this should have been the end. His treasury was empty. His father's best generals were maneuvering for personal power, and a Crusader army was consolidating its hold on the only major city his father had ever captured from the Latins. Every piece of conventional wisdom said he would be erased within 12 months. Yet something in the boy's mind worked differently than what his enemies expected. Instead of marching immediately to recover Edessa, which is what his father would have done, Nur ad-Din did nothing visible for 8 months. He held court. He distributed gifts. He married his father's widow, a political move that stabilized one faction of the court. The Franks grew confident. They began planning deeper incursions into the territory around Aleppo, believing the boy was too weak to respond. They left their garrisons undermanned, certain that no real threat existed beyond their field armies. This was the pattern that would destroy them. Nur ad-Din had learned from watching his father that a Crusader state was not a single fortress. It was a network of dependencies. Each castle, each fortified town, each agricultural village was a node. Cut the right nodes, and the entire system hemorrhaged supply lines faster than it could reinforce them. He began with the small forts, not the major Crusader strongholds that would require lengthy sieges and tie down his limited forces. Not the cities that the Franks defended with their best troops. He targeted the supply depots, the water stations, the road junctions that connected Edessa to the Crusader heartland of Antioch. The first to fall was the fortress of Al-Atharib, which sat on the road connecting Edessa to the Mediterranean coast. Nur ad-Din led the assault personally, a detail that later chroniclers found so improbable they debated it for centuries. a 12-year-old boy riding at the head of a column of Turkic cavalry, his padded armor hanging loose on his frame, pointing toward the walls with a sword that was too heavy for him to lift with one hand. His men did not follow him because they believed in his military genius. They followed him because he did what no adult commander in his position would have dared. He kept the army moving. He never stopped to besiege a castle that could not be taken quickly. He never allowed the Franks to pin him into a battle where their heavier cavalry would have crushed his lighter forces. By the autumn of 1146, Nur ad-Din had cut every road leading into Edessa. The Crusader garrison could still receive messages by pigeon, but no supply convoy could reach them without being ambushed by his mobile raiding columns. The city was starving, and the Franks inside knew that help would not come. The siege of Edessa did not look like the great sieges of the Crusades that textbooks describe. There were no towering siege towers, no massive trebuchets hurling stone shot day and night. Nur ad-Din did not have the resources for any of that. Instead, his engineers dug a single tunnel beneath the weakest section of the wall, a section that had been repaired hastily after his father's original breach 3 years earlier. They worked at night, carrying the excavated earth away in leather bags so that the defenders on the walls would see no piles of fresh dirt. The tunnel ran for 37 days before it reached the foundations. On the night of the 38th day, the sappers packed the tunnel with dry brush and set it alight. The fire consumed the wooden supports, and the section of wall above the tunnel collapsed into a cloud of dust and falling stone. Nur ad-Din's cavalry poured through the gap before the rubble had stopped settling. Edessa fell for the second time in 3 years. This time, it would not return to Frankish hands. Now you've seen the turning point, the moment a boy dismantled a Crusader state with patience and a single tunnel. If you want to stay with this story all the way to Jerusalem, subscribe and become part of a community that reads between the lines of conventional history. And I want to hear from you. Which aspect of this siege, the methodical road cutting, the night digging, or the final collapse, struck you as the most audacious move for a 12-year-old commander? Now consider what this meant for the balance of power. The county of Edessa had been the easternmost bulwark of the Crusader states. Its loss severed the land corridor between the Principality of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders could no longer reinforce their northern territories without a risky sea voyage or a march through hostile territory that left their columns exposed. But the boy was not done. He understood something that his enemies refused to accept. The Crusader states were not 4 independent kingdoms operating in parallel. They were a single organism with multiple limbs. Sever the supply lines between them, and the organism would die limb by limb, never able to concentrate its full strength against any single attacker. Over the next 2 years, Nur ad-Din methodically dismantled the infrastructure that connected the Crusader states. He seized the fortress of Harim, which controlled the road from Antioch to Edessa. He took the town of Apamea, cutting the southern supply route. He captured the bridge over the Orontes River, which the Franks had used for decades to move troops from the coast to the interior. Each capture followed the same pattern: a swift raid, a brief siege that exploited a specific weakness in the defenses, and then a garrison installed before the Crusaders could muster a relief force. The pattern was so consistent that later military historians would call it the Nur ad-Din method, though he would never have used such a term. By the end of 1149, Nur ad-Din had not yet reached the age of 14. He controlled a territory that stretched from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean coast. He had destroyed the second largest Crusader state and reduced the other 3 to a defensive crouch from which they never fully recovered. The standard explanation for this is that Nur ad-Din was a military genius, which is true but insufficient. Genius alone does not explain how a child held together a coalition of Turkic tribesmen, Kurdish mercenaries, Armenian auxiliaries, and Arab city militias, each with their own loyalties and grievances. What the evidence shows is that Nur ad-Din understood the psychology of coalition warfare better than any adult commander in the region. He never asked his subordinates to do something he would not do himself. He always divided the spoils of victory fairly, keeping no more for himself than he gave to his lieutenants. He personally visited the wounded after every battle, a practice that earned him a loyalty no amount of gold could buy. There is a story from the Chronicle of Ibn al-Athir that captures this. After the second capture of Edessa, a young soldier in Nur ad-Din's army was found looting a church. The penalty under Islamic military law was amputation of the hand. The soldier's commander begged for mercy, arguing that the boy was young and had not understood the prohibition. Nur ad-Din did not grant clemency. He stood in the courtyard of the citadel and watched the sentence carried out. Then he paid the soldier's family from his own treasury. To his officers, he said only this: kindness to individuals must never weaken the law that protects the army as a whole. This is the forgotten principle that explains the rise of Nur ad-Din. He was not simply a tactical prodigy. He was a builder of institutions. Every fortress he captured, he garrisoned with men he had trained personally. Every tax he collected, he recorded in duplicate ledgers so that embezzlement became impossible. Every treaty he signed, he enforced with ruthless consistency. The Crusaders could not adapt to this because they kept trying to defeat him militarily. They looked at his age and saw inexperience. They looked at his army and saw a rabble of tribal horsemen. They never looked at the system he was building, the infrastructure of governance that would outlast any single battlefield defeat. By the time Nur ad-Din had grown into his full stature, standing tall enough to wield the sword that had once been too heavy, the Crusader states were already doomed. Not because he had outfought them, but because he had out-organized them. The year 1154 marked the completion of this transformation. Nur ad-Din unified the Muslim cities of Syria under a single administration, something that had not been achieved since the Seljuk Empire fractured a generation earlier. Damascus fell without a siege, its governor recognizing that resistance was futile against a state machine that controlled every road leading into the city. When the Second Crusade arrived in the Holy Land, expecting to find the same fractured Muslim politics that had allowed the First Crusade to succeed, they found instead a unified command that could concentrate forces faster than they could coordinate their own disparate armies. The Crusaders never recovered, not because they lacked courage or resources, but because they had been outmaneuvered by a boy who understood that war is not won by the strongest army, but by the best system. And that system, built by a 12-year-old who refused to act his age, would eventually produce Saladin, the man who would reclaim Jerusalem itself. If this layered understanding of history, the kind that reveals the hidden machinery behind events, is what you came here for, then you already know what matters to this channel. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next deep dive into the forgotten systems that shaped our world. And tell me in the comments, which moment in Nur ad-Din's rise surprised you the most?